Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good whatever time you're watching this at. So we're looking at cell signaling today and the importance of hormones as part of that and the different types of hormones, i.e. the difference between steroid or lipid-based hormones and polypeptide or protein-based hormones. So that's what we're going to focus on as part of that, and in your lesson time I'll ask you to do some questions on that as well. That'll all be up via Google Classroom, okay? So this covers the stuff you were looking at on Thursday or Wednesday, depending on which class you are, overviewing just the basics of cell signaling, okay? So remember, in signaling we always have reception, and that's the cell receiving the signaler, which we often call the ligand, okay? And that can be either on the cell membrane or in the cell cytosol. We'll look a bit about that later on in this video. But basically, that is what we mean by reception. The hormone, the ligand, the signal, whatever, reaching the cell. We then have transduction. So transduction is the movement of the signal through the cell. And again, that happens differently in lipid-based hormones and protein-based hormones, which we'll look at later. And secondary messengers can be used during this, and that's especially during protein-based ones. Finally, there is a response. So the signal reaches the nucleus in some way, and the nucleus will do some sort of response as a result of that. That response could be for the cell cytoskeleton to change shape, changing the shape of the cell in some way. It could be to begin transcribing a gene. It could be to stop transcribing a gene. It could be for the cell to do apoptosis. It could be for the metabolism of the cell to speed up. There's lots of things that can happen. But basically, the response is the cell doing something because it's got the signal, okay? So focusing on hormones, because we're looking at cell signaling, they're not the only things we'll look at in cell signaling. We will look at neurotransmitters, we'll look at pheromones, and we'll look at hormones in plants. These are mostly animal hormones. But hormones, animal-based hormones, are the main things that we're looking at in relation to this. So as I put there, they are the main messaging molecules used by the body. Remember, the body does message via the nervous system too, but that uses electrical impulses rather than molecules. So the main messaging molecules of the body are hormones. And hormones and the glands that produce them form what we call the endocrine system, okay? So just a note, if you ever hear anything referring to endocrine or the endocrine system, it's talking about hormones basically. So maybe you might get an exam question that's being a bit vague about what it's talking about, but if it mentions endocrine in the stem, it probably wants you to link the answer to hormones in some way. So down at the bottom, I've got some information about the differences between the main types of hormones. So steroid hormones are sometimes called lipid-based, and I tend to refer to them more often as lipid-based. VCAR on the exams can refer to them in both ways, all right? But either way, if they're lipid-based, that means they are lipid-soluble. And what that means is if they are lipid-soluble, they're able to pass directly through the plasma membrane, okay? So that's a key difference of these steroid or lipid hormones. They can pass through the plasma membrane. And these hormones tend to be quite long-lasting. For example, estrogen and testosterone can stick around in the body for quite a bit. Those are steroid-based hormones, and yeah. And then we've got our polypeptide-based hormones, sometimes called amino acid-based or protein-based. I'll tend to refer to them as protein-based, but again, VCAR can say polypeptide, amino acid, protein. Again, it all means the same thing. And hopefully from outcome 1, that's quite familiar with you, that you know that polypeptides and amino acids and proteins are all very closely interlinked. So these cannot pass through the cell membrane. They're not able to, like the lipid-based ones. So they bind with a receptor on the cell membrane. They can't get through the cell membrane, so they have to bind with a receptor on the cell membrane. That will then cause the cell membrane to change shape, and that will activate secondary messengers inside of the cell to get the signal through to the nucleus, which will do some sort of response. These tend to be shorter lasting hormones, and maybe you've heard of adrenaline or antidiuretic hormone. ADH, those are both hormones that are protein-based. So I've got this diagram here that just goes through the mode of action for both of them. So I'll just try and make sure they're both nice and visible. So I'll start with this steroid-based one. So looking at the diagram first, the green shade that I've got there is the hormone. And as you can see in step 1, it's passed straight through the cell membrane. So the receptor is inside the cell, that's the purple blob. The receptor and the hormone come together, a bit like when an enzyme and a substrate meet, and they form a hormone receptor complex. So where we've got the purple blob with the smaller green blob inside of it, that's the hormone receptor complex. The hormone receptor complex then moves to the nucleus together, so that's transducing the signal onwards, and then the nucleus will do some sort of response. And down at the bottom, I've just got a step 1 to 4 of what's happening there. So I'll just leave that up for a couple of seconds for you to have a look at. I will put this sheet onto Google Classroom as well, if you can deal with my bad handwriting, which I'm sure you can. You're well used to it now. Okay. And here is the polypeptide or protein-based one. So the blue diamond is the hormone and the pink Y shape is the receptor. So you notice the hormone now is not binding inside the cell, it is binding with the receptor outside of the cell. Then those small purple shapes are meant to represent the secondary messengers. The secondary messengers are activated by the receptor and they begin sending the signal through the cell. There may be more than one secondary messenger, but anything that happens after the initial receptor is called a secondary messenger. Even if there are a couple of them, they're all called secondary messengers. And those signals eventually get to the nucleus, and again, the nucleus does something as a response. So once again, I'll just put on there for you, so hopefully you can read them for a bit. Those are the key points that happen there, and again, this document will be on Google Classroom. Okay, what I'm going to ask you to do now is to make sure you have the slideshow that I've already put onto Google Classroom accessible. So you may want to pause this video quickly while you get them. It can be either a hard copy or a digital copy. If you've got a digital copy, you don't need to be watching this video, but you keep it playing because I'm going to talk you through some key points on these slides. So if you get yourself to slide 23, like I say, pause it now, give yourself a few seconds to go and find that, get to slide 23. Okay, so focusing on slide 23, focusing on protein-based hormones. So that's going through the fact that after binding, the receptor changes shape, and then what we call a cascade of secondary messengers are released. A cascade just means one messenger may activate another messenger, which activates another messenger, which activates another messenger. Okay, so it's one messenger setting off another. And there may be something called amplification required for this to happen. Amplification basically keeps the signal going strong as it goes through the cell. And there's a diagram of amplification, I believe, on slide 25 with the CAMP molecule. So you can have a look at slide 25 if you want to. Now looking at slide 24, that diagram shows both what happens for a lipid-based hormone and a protein-based hormone. I believe it mostly focuses on the protein-based one as far as the explanation goes. And I think down in the left corner it says that after the hormone has been done its purpose, it can be broken down by enzymes and eliminated. And that's the same for lipid-based or protein-based. If you think about it, hormones obviously are really important, but we don't want them to keep on doing their role after they don't serve their purpose anymore. Looking on to slide 26, we've got an example of what happens in the lipid-based one in a bit more detail, so you can have a read through that. Just talking about the idea of it, binding with the intracellular receptor, meaning in the cell, forming that hormone receptor complex, and moving to the nucleus. And then there's an example of some of the various responses that the cell may do on slide 26 as well. So that's what I was talking about earlier. The signal may be for the cell to undergo apoptosis, where the cell dies in a controlled way. It may be for the cell to produce a protein. It may be for the cell to stop producing a protein. Lots of things they can do, but they'll do some sort of response because of that. And diagram 27 has that slide 27 has that diagram that you looked at earlier, with the but focusing more on the lipid-based ones of what's happening. Again, slide 28, which I recommend you read through in your own time, that just overviews the major differences between the lipid or steroid-based hormones and the polypeptide or protein-based hormones. So we've talked about most of them through this session, but yeah. Slide 29 just goes through the key point that you need to get out of that is that lipids or steroids, the hormones, lipid or steroid-based hormones tend to be a bit slower to activate once they reach the cell, but then they tend to be longer lasting. So once the hormone reaches the target cell, they take a while to begin doing their purpose, but then they stick around for quite a long amount of time. Whereas protein-based ones are faster to activate once they reach the target cell, but they are short-lasting. And to use an example of that, we talked about adrenaline being a protein-based hormone. Adrenaline is often released in response to stressful situations, and if you've ever done something like an extreme roller coaster, bungee jumping, something like that, you get a huge adrenaline rush afterwards. So that's your body responding to what it perceives as something dangerous, even though it's not actually dangerous. But it's responding to something it perceives as being dangerous, so it releases adrenaline, which gets your body ready to either fight or flee the situation, the fight or flight response. I'm sure you can imagine, though, you don't want that sticking around in your system for too long, because otherwise your body would be continually at this really on-edge state. So adrenaline is a short-lasting hormone. Fast to activate, but short-lasting. Anyway, that's an overview of the major differences between steroid-based and protein-based hormones. And like I say, there's some information on Google Classroom about what I expect you to do in relation to that. Okay, keep working hard.